Okay, so we are going to talk through some structures related to the urinary system. And so if you want to follow along with your lab outline, these are the structures that we're going to be talking about. So to start with, when we look at the urinary system, the structures that we are highlighting are the kidneys. And so we've got our right kidney and then our left kidney. Um, Urine is going to drain from the kidneys through the ureter. So that's going to travel down through the body and it's going to drain into the urinary bladder and then eventually make its way to the outside of the body through the urethra. And so those are the organs that we are talking about when we talk about the urinary system. Some roles of the kidneys. So, what do the kidneys do for us? They are responsible for excreting substances that our body no longer needs. So, in terms of like metabolic waste products or excess ions, um, we're able to get rid of those substances through our urine. On the flip side, there are some things that we want to hold on to, so like glucose and amino acids. So those are initially filtered into the urine, but we actually want to take those back. So we're going to be able to reabsorb some of the substances back into our body that we want to hold on to. The kidneys also play a large role in the regulation of the volume and chemical composition of the blood. And so, one of the things that we had talked about before was how blood volume and urine volume are inversely related. And so, if we have increased urine volume, we are ultimately going to end up losing a lot of volume through our urine, and so that's going to end up decreasing our blood volume. Okay, and so that's why you see like some patients who may have high blood pressure, we want to decrease their blood pressure. We do that by decreasing their blood volume. And the way that we can treat that clinically is giving those patients a diuretic, which makes them use the bathroom more. And it's going to ultimately increase their urine volume, which is going to have the result of decreasing their blood volume and bringing their pressure back down. So we have this relationship there with blood volume and urine volume. And then the kidneys play a role in producing renin, which allows us to control blood pressure. And then also erythropoietin, which if you recall from a couple different topics that we've talked about this year, like skeletal system and blood, erythropoietin is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. So that is one of the sites of its release is the kidney. So if you look at a posterior view of the kidney, where they're located, the kidneys are retroperitoneal, so meaning that they lie basically right up against the posterior body wall behind the peritoneum. And if you look from the back, this is a posterior view. So here's my right kidney. Kidneys sit at about the vertebral level of about T12 to L3. And so that's, usually the level that they are located in. And the right kidney sits down a little bit lower because we've got this humongous liver that takes up all this space on the right side. Okay, if we look at an individual kidney and we cut it open and we look at it from the inside, we see three different regions of the kidney. The first one is going to be the cortex, and we see this term cortex in a lot of different capacities in anatomy. And cortex typically means the outer crust. So think about this from before. We had cerebral cortex, which was that outer, 2 millimeters of brain. We had adrenal cortex, which was the outer part of the adrenal gland. Well, here we've got renal cortex. It's the same thing. It's going to be the outermost third of the kidney. So it's going to be kind of this crust here on the outside. And then if we go in a little deeper, we come to our second region, and this is the medulla. And this is another term that we're familiar with. The adrenal medulla was the inside of the adrenal gland. Well, here we've got the renal medulla. So it's going to be kind of the interior 2/3 of the kidney. And we're going to see some structures there. Here's our pyramids. Here's our columns, which are these kind of long areas of tissue in between the pyramids. And we're going to talk about those. And then our third region of the kidney is going to be this area through here. And this is called the renal pelvis. And this is basically kind of a collecting duct for urine. And ultimately, urine is going to travel and collect in the pelvis and then ultimately leave the kidney through the ureter, which is going to be this structure here. So, talk a little bit more about some structures that we see within the renal medulla. Well, you see these alternating areas of color changes. So this leads us to our renal pyramids, which are going to be these triangular shaped areas that are located in the region of the renal medulla. So you can see all of these guys. And so basically what happens is our kidney is divided up into lobes. And most kidneys have about 8 lobes. And a lobe is going to consist of a renal pyramid, which is going to be this darker colored triangular shaped structure. And then in between the renal pyramids, we have the renal columns. And so basically what this is this is cortical tissue. So remember the cortex is that, kind of outer third of the kidney. Well, in between the pyramids, the cortical tissue travels down and it invaginates in between those renal pyramids. So this is actually going to be cortical tissue. The renal columns are cortical tissue that have traveled down in between the pyramids. So one lobe of the kidney is going to be a pyramid plus the renal column on either side of it. Okay, and so generally what we've got is we're going to have about 8 of those per kidney, and that's the way that they're arranged. So this is another view here. You can see here's our pyramid, so our triangular shaped structure that's located in the area of the medulla. And what's going to happen with these guys is that you can see that the pyramid has an apex down here at the bottom. So they're basically all like pointing towards the interior part of the kidney or the renal pelvis. And that's exactly what happens. So at the bottom of the pyramid, at the apex or the pointy part, we've got a structure called the renal papilla. And so that's going to be this area here. So that's going to be basically the pointy part. And we're going to have urine that's draining through the pyramid, heading down towards that renal papilla. Okay? So what ends up happening is the renal papilla, each papilla is surrounded by this little cup structure. And so if you look at this on the kidneys, it kind of looks like this little membrane that's surrounding the pointy part of the pyramid. And we call that the minor calyx. So this is basically like a little cup. So each pyramid is going to drain into a papilla, and then it's going to drain from the papilla into a minor calyx. So each one of these is going to have a minor calyx, a little cup surrounding the bottom of it. Okay? So now what happens is that each minor calyx is going to join together and form a major calyx. So like in this example, this structure right here is going to be the major calyx. Okay, so that's the structure here. So as we can see, we've got 3 minor calyces that are all going to merge together to form a major calyx. And that's exactly what happens. So I mean, if we were to, kind of draw this out, we'd have a major or a minor calyx, maybe another minor calyx here, and they're all basically coming together to form a major calyx. Okay, so each kidney only has like 2 or 3 major calyces, so they don't have nearly as many of those, but basically everything's kind of draining together. It's basically like a series of drainage, tubes or even drainage ditches that are going to drain that urine from the kidney to the outside of the kidney. So we have 2 to 3 major calyces in each kidney. And what's going to happen is that those major calyces are going to ultimately join to create the renal pelvis. Okay, and so that's the structure here right in the center. So this is basically like the large drainage ditch. Everything's draining to this area, and then the renal pelvis continues to the outside of the kidney as this kind of muscular tube called the ureter. And so urine is basically traveling down each of these pyramids. It is flowing out of the pyramid through the renal papilla. It's going to then flow into a minor calyx. Several minor calyces are going to drain into a major calyx. And then several major calyces join together to create the renal pelvis, which is then going to convey the urine into the ureter, and it's going to travel down to the urinary bladder. So that's kind of the sequence of events and the structures that it travels through. Okay, and so we have a right ureter that's going to take urine from the right kidney. We have a left ureter that's going to take urine from the left kidney. And these guys, they're not just like, passive tubes. They actually have smooth muscle embedded in the walls of those tubes. And so they actually contract, and they're going to propel the urine down to the bladder. So we call that process peristalsis. And that should sound familiar, like we talked about that with the digestive system, with the esophagus and the rest of the GI tract. But the same thing happens here in the urinary system. And so we're basically going to travel down, and each of those ureters is going to drain into the urinary bladder. And so what we see is kind of an opening for each of the ureters. And then we see an opening at the bottom, which is our internal urethral orifice. And that's where the urethra is going to drain blood that's being, or urine that's being stored in the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. Okay, so we do have this interesting structure that's created by these three tubes, and you can kind of see this triangular shaped area here that's formed. Well, we call that the trigone, and that's kind of interesting. Like, this is kind of a smooth area within the urinary bladder, and it's kind of interesting because this is an area, if you are someone who's prone to bladder infections, this is an area where bladder infections like to occur. So it just happens to, happen there maybe more than other areas within the bladder. But that's what's interesting about the trigone. Okay, so we've looked at gross anatomy. Now let's go in and we'll look at the microscopic anatomy of the kidney. So this is basically looking at the nephron. So nephrons are very, very tiny. Like, each one of your kidneys has about 1 million nephrons in it. So they are very tiny, and they are considered to be the structural and functional unit of the kidney. This is where all the magic happens. This is how urine is formed, and this is how kidneys do their job. So when we look at nephrons consist of 2 structures. They have a renal corpuscle, and they have a renal tubule. So if we were to kind of map this out, we have a nephron. So it's going to consist of a corpuscle and then a corpuscle is going to consist of a glomerulus, and the second part of that is going to be a renal capsule, otherwise known as Bowman's capsule. Okay, so that corpuscle consists of these two structures. Nephron is going to consist of both a corpuscle and a renal tubule, which, as we see, is going to have different parts to it, like a proximal convoluted tubule. It's going to have a loop of Henle or nephron loop, and it's going to have a distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so that's kind of the way this is all organized and how it's arranged. So in terms of the renal corpuscle, and again, this is going to consist of both the glomerulus, which is like this tangled knot of capillaries, and the glomerular capsule that surrounds it, otherwise known as Bowman's capsule. The renal corpuscle is located in the renal cortex. So again, that's going to be, if we have our kidney, that's going to be like that outer third of the kidney. That's that outer crust. Okay, so that's where the corpuscle is located. And if we look at the glomerulus, it's basically this tangled network of capillaries. And as we learned in blood vessels, we have different types of capillaries. And this particular type of capillary is a fenestrated capillary, because this is going to be the site of filtration. And so we need to have pores so that filtrate or fluid can filter from the capillary into the capsule. And the glomerular capsule is going to be surrounding the glomerulus, so basically it can catch all of that filtrate that's moving from the glomerulus. Here's my glomerulus, my tangled knot of capillaries, and here's my arteriole leading out of it, and then we can draw this kind of capsule around it. It's basically just kind of forming this structure that's surrounding that tangled knot of capillaries, and fluid is going to travel into this capillary. Because that capillary is porous, because it's fenestrated, that pressure is going to push some of the fluid from the capillary into Bowman's capsule, and then the rest of the fluid that doesn't get pushed into Bowman's capsule is going to leave the glomerulus. So this fluid that gets pushed into Bowman's capsule and starts to travel down the renal tubule is called filtrate, and that's what we talk about there. Okay, and so this is what we see here too. Here's our glomerulus. Here is Bowman's capsule encapsulating or kind of encircling that glomerulus, and so both of these two together are going to make up that renal corpuscle. And so that's what we're talking about there. Here's my afferent arteriole, which is bringing blood into the glomerulus. Okay. Here's my efferent arteriole that's leading blood away from the glomerulus. Okay. And because this capillary, number one, is fenestrated and it's got holes in it, and number two, it's under higher pressure than a typical capillary bed, we have the process of filtration, which is going to push fluid from the capillary into Bowman's capsule. And it basically gets collected, and then it starts to travel through the renal tubule. Okay, and so that's basically what this looks like here. We're forming filtrate at this point because we filtered blood from the glomerulus into the tubule. Okay, a couple different ways to look at that. This is pointing out the fact that that the renal corpuscle begins or is located in the cortex. So this is a lot of this happens in the cortex of the kidney. And then if we look at the rest of our renal tubule, so if we kind of isolate this area here, we've got our glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, so that's going to be our corpuscle. Well, the rest of this is the renal tubule. So what's included in the renal tubule? Well, we've got the proximal convoluted tubule, which is going to be this structure here. Then we're going to head downwards through the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and this is also otherwise known as a nephron loop. So you'll see that, sometimes you'll see that listed as well. Here's our descending limb, and then we're going to come back up the other side through our ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and then head into our distal convoluted tubule here. Okay, and at that point so everything's basically traveling in this direction. We've ended our renal tubule. Okay, so once we stop at the distal convoluted tubule, that's the end of the renal tubule, because what we're going to drain into at that point is called a collecting duct. And we have many distal convoluted tubules from many different nephrons that are actually draining into that collecting duct. And at this point, we've got urine, because what's happening is the filtrate that moved from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule has traveled through this whole renal tubule, and it's been changed. Like, we've reabsorbed some substances, we've secreted some substances, we've reabsorbed water, and we've modified that filtrate into urine. And so at this point, traveling through the collecting duct is urine, and that's what we want to get rid of. So what we end up seeing is urine traveling through the collecting ducts, heading down towards the apex of that pyramid, and this picks back up with what we learned before, that those collecting ducts drain into the renal papilla here at the pointy part of the pyramid. Another interesting thing about this too is because if you look at the renal pyramids, they have kind of a striated appearance. They look kind of striped, and that's because renal pyramids are the place where we have all these collecting ducts, traveling down. There's tons of them, and they're all kind of organized parallel to each other, traveling through that medullary pyramid and conveying urine down to the papilla so that it can drain to the minor calyx and then the major calyx and then out through the renal pelvis and the ureter. Okay, I did want to touch base on the two types of nephrons. So nephrons come in a couple different varieties. The most common type of nephron is a cortical nephron, and most nephrons, about 85%, are cortical, and that means that they are primarily located in the cortex, so in that outer third of the kidney. The other type of nephron is called a juxtamedullary nephron, and that's what we see here. Juxtamedullary nephrons have these really long loops of Henle, and they dive way down into the medulla part of the kidney, and they are responsible for generating or creating very concentrated urine. So they have the ability to absorb lots more water as they travel through that long loop of Henle. We're able to pull in a lot more water, so the resulting urine is a lot more concentrated. So here's our little cortical nephron here. It's basically located just in the cortex of the kidney. Here's our juxtamedullary nephron with its really long loop of Henle that dives down deep. Okay, here are 3 processes that end up creating urine. And we're going to go into this more in lecture with the renal physiology, but it is important to know that these processes are happening. So the first process is going to be glomerular filtration, and this is what we talked about before. This is the process of filtrate being pushed from the glomerulus, from that capillary bed, into Bowman's capsule. So that's the process of filtration. Then as this filtrate makes its way through our renal tubule, we can modify it by doing 2 different things to it. Number 1, we can reabsorb substances that we want to hold on to. So the renal tubule is surrounded by capillaries, and we call those peritubular capillaries. So we can take substances that we want to hold on to and we can move them from the tubule back into the capillary because there are things that we want to keep. And we call that process reabsorption. Now, on the flip side, there are things that we want to get rid of. And so there are substances that we can move from our bloodstream into the tubule because we know that anything that's in the tubule is going to end up leaving the body as urine. So we can get rid of it. So it may be like metabolic waste products or drugs or poison. We can move those substances from our capillaries into the tubule, and we know that they're going to be excreted from our body as urine. So we call that tubular secretion. Okay? And so this is kind of an overview of what's happening with that. Anything in red here is the process of reabsorption. So these arrows, and if you look at it, we're moving from the tubule and we're going to move it into the blood vessels that are basically, traveling right along with the tubule. So these substances are going to move into our blood vessel because we want to hold on to it. So we've got glucose, amino acids, water is a big thing. We want to reclaim as much water as possible. Now, if you'll notice here too, our descending limb of the loop of Henle, we are only able to reabsorb water. So that is only happening, water reabsorption is only happening, or the descending loop of Henle is only able to reabsorb water. Okay? The ascending limb of the loop of Henle is a little different. It's only able to reabsorb salt or sodium chloride. So that's kind of interesting. Now on the flip side of things, we can secrete substances. So for instance, like drugs and poisons, we've got excess ions that we no longer need. We've got urea and other metabolic waste products that we actually want to get rid of. So we're going to move those from our bloodstream into the tubule so that we can secrete them. I also want to point out another fact here is most of our reabsorption is happening here in our proximal convoluted tubule. So it's perfectly suited for reabsorption. It's got microvilli present in that proximal convoluted tubule, which increases surface area and allows for increased reabsorption. So most of that's happening in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, this is the last thing that I want to talk about here. We talked a little bit about the peritubular capillaries, and so that's what this is showing you here. Here's our tubule. So we've got, let's see, here's our afferent arteriole, which is, bringing blood into the glomerulus, right? So we're heading in this way. And here's our efferent arteriole that's leading away from the glomerulus. And what ends up happening is our efferent arteriole ends up creating this peritubular capillary network that basically surrounds the tubule. So anything that we want to reabsorb, we're going to move from the tubule into that peritubular capillary. And anything that we want to secrete, we're going to move it the opposite way. So it's going to go from the capillary into the tubule, because then we can excrete it as urine. But that efferent arteriole is going to continue and create the peritubular capillaries that surround the tube. Now, we do have a specific peritubular capillary bed, and that's called the vasa recta. And this is going to be the specific capillary bed related to juxtamedullary nephrons. So if you have a nephron that has that really long loop of Henle dipping down into the medulla, its peritubular capillary network is specifically called vasa recta. Okay? If it's a cortical nephron, then its peritubular capillary bed is just called peritubular capillary bed. Okay? So that's just a little detail there. Okay?